Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to another episode in our Season 2 finale series in which we're recapping major genre groups across the entirety of the 1990s. In today's episode, we're wrapping up metal in all of its forms. There's only 3 forms. Just as a reminder, if you're interested in listening to any other episodes in this recap series, you could feel free to check out any of them that have dropped so far, and there's also more to come, so keep your eyes out for more. As well, if you're interested in listening to any of the songs that I talk about in today's episode, please feel free to check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of this episode here. As well, if you're looking for my big list for the entirety of the 90s, I will be dropping it in conjunction with the last episode in this recap series, so keep your eyes out for that as well. So, what are we going to talk about today? As usual with this recap series, we're going to talk about what we recapped in the 1980s for metal. Next, we're going to overview the subgenres we'll be talking about today, and then finally, we'll dive into each of the subgenres with milestone songs across the decade and why we chose them. So, let's talk about the 1980s recap for a second. To start off with, we highlighted Black Sabbath's Neon Nights, and then we moved into Wake Up by Megadeth, and then finally Terrible Lie by Nine Inch Nails. So just based upon that list right there and what I know of 90s metal music, we basically went from arena rock / the new wave of British heavy metal to a certain extent with Black Sabbath's Neon Nights, but it was mostly classic rock, let's just say. But it was mostly heavy metal. But then Megadeth, Wake Up Dead, that was a slightly different variety of heavy metal that was a little bit more leaning into death metal ideas, black metal ideas, punkish ideas. And so Megadeth was towing that line between being metal, but also being a little bit punkish at the same time, which was that evolution. And then finally, with Nine Inch Nails, that's industrial metal. So it's just a totally different transition. The interesting thing about industrial metal, though, which is going to help us transition into our subgenres, so Nine Inch Nails and industrial metal, especially with Terrible Lie, created, in one way or another, the movement at the time helped create these 3 subgenres that we're going to talk about today, which are big buckets and overlap with each other incessantly. And it made it really hard for me to tease them out and understand who's doing what, when, where, why, because all these genres were overlapping so much. But 3 distinct genres did emerge, and they're all pretty related to each other. And one could say that to a certain extent, ideas like Nine Inch Nails' Terrible Lie in 1989 was that big bang point that created these distinctive metal subgenres in the 1990s. So one thing that I'll also talk about at a macro level about metal, which I think we talked about in one or more episodes across season 2, is that grunge and the neo-roots rock movement, so let's just say Nirvana and Pearl Jam, started to take control over the whole rock and metal sphere at one point. Because at least for grunge was sucking up a lot of metal ideas into its engine as a rocket booster and blasting off with it. And so there was a time when it was difficult to distinguish between what was grunge and what was metal, where grunge was probably like metal light because it was much more rock than it was metal, but definitely incorporating metal ideas. And so it took a hot minute for metal to really find its own distinctive voice again. There were some key players that were happening in the beginning of the 90s, but it took grunge rock dying and evolving into post-grunge for a lot of these metal ideas to take even greater shape. And we will display that pretty clearly when we get to talking about these subgenres and their trajectories. Moving into that, the 3 genres that we're going to talk about today are alternative metal, industrial metal, and new metal, and not new like NEW, but NU, new metal. So the problem with these 3 is that they all kind of sound like each other, and you'll probably listen to a lot of these tracks and say, how, SJ, did you distinguish between this track being industrial metal versus being new metal versus being alternative metal? And let me tell you, it was a Herculean effort, because the way that I had to sort it out was I had to start with industrial metal, because it was already well established. Nine Inch Nails declared with tracks like Terrible Lie in their 1989 album that this was industrial metal. This is its own thing. It's very distinctive. It's separate. It's its own thing. But then you had this alternative metal idea that was taking not alternative rock as in Pixie style alternative rock, but the neo roots rock, retro roots rock ideas a la Pearl Jam, and then incorporating some of that Eddie Vedder sound into metal ideas. And at the same time, too, you had bands in the 80s like Megadeth that were carrying forward some of these alternative metal ideas. You obviously also had, at the very beginning of the decade, bands like Metallica that had also evolved from the Megadeth-ish sort of ideas, and they were doing speed metal and thrash metal, and they were moving some of those ideas forward. So a lot of these bands too weren't necessarily sounding so much like Eddie Vedder as maybe they were sounding like James Hetfield from Metallica. And so they were just going in that direction. So when we talk about the beginning here, alternative metal is taking some James Hetfield, taking a little bit of Eddie Vedder, taking a little bit of what Megadeth was doing, taking a teeny tiny bit of industrial, but barely any at all, and we're making alternative metal. And then new metal. So new metal is basically taking alternative metal and industrial metal and a little bit of a riff to it, like a rap idea maybe, like a turntablist component, or maybe a extra little artifact in there, and it creates this whole new thing called new metal. And it's rightly called new metal because it's a totally new, different thing, and it's incorporating a lot of stuff together to create this whole new idea. So when you think about new metal as an idea, it's a little bit of alternative metal, it's a little bit of industrial metal, it may be a little bit of half rapping to it. And the thing too is that as industrial metal and alternative metal start to wane a little bit, new metal continues to evolve and take further shapes, and the rapping becomes more distinctive, etc., as we get into the 2000s. So this is to say that the entire metal sphere, the whole metal community, was really bouncing off of each other pretty continuously, sharing ideas, borrowing concepts, and also, again, a lot of these albums would span these three genres continuously. Like one track would be alternative metal, one would be new metal, one would be industrial metal, then new metal again, then alternative metal, then industrial. And so it was just constantly switching back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so you're about to experience this because we slide across a couple genres here with some individual artists and albums. And it's what made this so complicated, that they were also aggressively sharing their ideas, trying to revive the metal community, basically, and take it into the 2000s now that it was decoupled from grunge's kung fu grip, that there was just a lot that needed to get done in a short period of time. So let's talk about alternative metal. Again, when we talk about alternative metal, it's, I would say, the one that is most clearly connected back furthest back into the 80s. So industrial metal was far newer, really kicking off about 88, 89. Alternative metal has deeper roots than that, especially because it is connected to bands like Metallica, which go back even further. And two, because of that, it's connected to more heavy metal ideas than any of these other subgenres. But it didn't really start in earnest until the 90s. So we'll start off then in 1990 with a proto example of alternative metal by a band that we're already familiar with from the 80s, which is Jane's Addiction on Ritual de lo Habitual. And the track is Stop with an exclamation point. Wildly popular track for them. It was a really great way to kick off the 90s for them. It, in many respects, made me hopeful that Jane's Addiction was going to keep rocking it all the way through the 90s, but they didn't bubble up nearly as much as I expected them to. This album is amazing. It's one of my favorites from the whole decade. But it was a great proto example of where alternative metal was going, because we can connect it back to what was happening with Jane's Addiction an album or two ago back into the 80s. And it sounds kind of like what we were listening to back then, but it's also got some new different ideas to it, and they're leaning into something different with Stop. It's still got their Jane's Addiction flavor, and it sounds still a little bit like maybe Pixies to a certain extent. They've got some angles in there that sound post-punk, alternative rock to them, but they've got these early markers too of what alternative metal would become, just again in how they play their guitars, the beats and the pacing, the framing of the whole song. It sounds like it's got 30% alternative metal. So it's just starting that conversation. But by 1992, we're already in full swing with the first wave with the track This Love on Vulgar Display of Power by Pantera, and we definitely did talk about this album in the 1992 episode. This is the one example that I'm going to give you that spans across subgenres that we're going to talk about today, but this one track specifically is alternative metal. This one. And that is not to say that the rest of this is alternative metal or new metal or industrial metal, because they could be all over the place and they mix together so heavily, sometimes it's hard to tell. This one, though, is purely first wave alternative metal because it's got a driving beat that sounds like it's that retro roots idea, like it sounds like it's Pearl Jam's 10 to a certain extent. It's got melody like it's rock and not quite metal, because metal is obviously typically harder than rock music is. So it's got a softness to it comparatively, but it's still obviously metal. Pantera is definitely metal music. This sounds a little bit like Metallica, maybe a little bit more so than it should. It's borrowing some ideas pretty considerably. It's got that emotion, that deep alternative metal emotion behind it, because the thing about metal too is that it's far more emotional than rock music is. And so this is metal to a T, first of all, but also a great way for us to start off the alternative metal conversation. And this is to say, too, that this is flying a little bit under the radar because it is that early 90s moment. We're deeply in the middle of grunge right now. And so this one's a little bit under the radar and probably just sort of serving the metal community what little there was to offer that was outside the spectrum of grunge or grunge adjacent things. So good on Pantera for holding the fort down while all these other artists were figuring themselves out. So then, to elicit the point, we skip 6 years and we go to the third wave. So we're just skipping right over the second wave and we're going right to the third wave with Marilyn Manson on his album Mechanical Animals, and the track is Coma White. We only talked about Marilyn Manson once when we were discussing Antichrist Superstar, which was a great album. That album in and of itself also spans all three of these genres here: alternative metal, industrial metal, and nu metal. Hard to distinguish between the three many times when you're jumping from one track to the next. Coma White, though, on Mechanical Animals is very firmly the third wave, and you could tell, too, where the evolution is going between This Love and Coma White, where, again, it's soft for metal music to a certain extent. Like, it's not melodic, but it's definitely not industrial metal, and it's not got a hard, punchy, driving beat or, rap elements or what have you, like nu metal does. This is still very firmly alternative rock with metal twists and angles to it. So on this album, Mechanical Animals by Marilyn Manson, it's more than likely just a come down track for him compared to some of the other industrial tracks that he was rocking or the nu metal tracks. So that, in interesting respects, is kind of what alternative metal was doing in 1998 in the third wave. It was a come down for much harder tracks on a much more complex album by one of these metal artists. It's interesting. So Coma White, like I said, it's softer, it's more contemplative, it's still metal at the end of the day, right? So it rocks hard, but it's definitely got a softness to it. And that's the direction that the evolution takes us. And then finally in 1999, we get to that fourth wave. So we had been hanging around the third wave for a year or two already. But again, now that we're in that post-grunge moment, now there's just aggressive evolution on the metal side. Now that metal has its space back again to itself, it's just going to aggressively push. And so we're going to hit these evolutions of waves, like one year it's this, next year it's that, the following year it's this whole new thing, and it just keeps pushing. I think that the third wave maybe only had a year or two, and now we're into this fourth wave with The Warmth by Incubus on their album Make Yourself. So this is fourth wave. It's, again, even more melodic. It's got even more neo-roots rock ideas that are thrown into it. Again, it's even softer. It still rocks, obviously, definitely still rocks because this is alternative metal, but it's got more of a melody to it. And it's that very clear evolution from Stop to This Love to Coma White to The Warmth. It's just this softening and softening and softening, but it's also refining a genre and creating a distinction of itself compared to these other two subgenres, because the other two subgenres are going in much more aggressive directions. Alternative metal is just remaining at a steady state of being a soft palate cleanser to this other stuff. It's really interesting how alternative metal was used as a juxtaposition for a lot of these artists. It's wild. So that capstones alternative metal. So now let's talk about industrial metal. So industrial metal was the one that we basically had as a foothold with Terrible Lie by Nine Inch Nails from 1989-ish. And that is declared as the first wave of industrial metal. You might remember from the 89 episode and even the recap of the 80s, where I talked about what industrial metal was, which was, it sounds like it was metal that was played in an industrial yard, and it's just got a lot of clanky beats like you're banging on anvils and banging on trash cans, and it just sounds very industrial. It also has a little bit of an electronica component to it that makes it pretty distinctly industrial metal versus alternative metal. Like, there's not really a lot of electronica at all in alternative metal at all. There might be electronic components, but it doesn't sound like electronica. It also doesn't have those hard metallic beats like industrial metal does. So that's the minute distinction between alternative metal and industrial metal. So we're actually going to start again with Nine Inch Nails in 1994 in the second wave. So they've ushered in the second wave at this point with the track Closer on The Downward Spiral. So this is an evolution off of their first wave into this new thing because the beats are a lot punchier, the electronica is more palatable. It sounds like it's kind of keeping up with where techno's going a little bit at the time. Trent Reznor's really just nailing it, staying ahead of the curve and staying out in front with these ideas. I mean, 1994, like, techno was just starting to become a thing, even more so with The Prodigy, for example. So he was really in the zeitgeist at that moment and leaning into what was fresh and new. And taking that inspiration where other people were figuring out new ways to use electronically derived sounds to add punch to their music, and he was doing it really effectively. Nine Inch Nails was way out in front when it comes to industrial metal. And with the second wave, it's just taking that even more so and adding let's just say, more techno to it. So then in 1997, again, once we've gotten on the other side of grunge, because with 1994's The Downward Spiral, Nine Inch Nails was out a little early. For whatever reason, the prediction was that we can come back out with industrial metal and we can reemerge again now that maybe people are ready to listen to it post-grunge hangover. So they came out in 1994. And then by 1997, aggressively evolving into a third wave with Du Hast by Rammstein on Sehnsucht. We didn't talk about Sehnsucht at all, which is a shame that I just blew right past it, because Sehnsucht is one of my favorite albums from the 90s period. Every track is awesome. Rammstein are amazing. Du Hast is such a great song. It's so great. I love this song. And it's not the only reason why it's on here, because it was just a really great example too of evolving into the third wave, where it's, interestingly enough, a little bit dancey now. It's like it's incorporating more Euro dancey ideas to it, and there's certainly techno to it, but it's kind of a little groovy and a little dancey to it. So the industrial ideas were getting played with in Closer by Nine Inch Nails in 94. Rammstein is taking in certainly more Euro dance-ish directions and adding even more of those techno ideas, house ideas to it. It's still very gritty and intense and emotional and metal. Du Hast is like pop metal to a certain extent, and dance metal, dance pop, whatever you want to say. But also it kind of sounds like death metal, thrash metal. Most of Sehnsucht sounds like death metal or some kind of Scandinavian metal. I mean, Rammstein, right? It's German. It's capturing a lot more than just industrial metal, which is the greatness that is Sehnsucht. But Du Hast just takes all of those components that were happening in Closer by Nine Inch Nails, carries it forward. So third wave. And then just 2 years later, we get to the fourth wave by Static X, which we definitely did not talk about during any of this season, on their album Wisconsin Death Trip, and the track is Bled for Days. This really sounds like Du Hast, first of all, period. But then also it's evolving into its next thing. It sounds even more modern. It sounds like it's just more confident. Like we have an even greater understanding for the things that Rammstein was playing with in 1997. And we're just carrying it forward even further. It sounds like we're just propelling ourselves into the 2000s with whatever comes next. So Bled for Days is another great track. Wisconsin Death Trip, we didn't talk about it, but Static X was really fun to listen to as I was going through the 90s recap, and it totally provides the point for me about where industrial metal was going into the 2000s. So fourth wave. So now that we've really laid out alternative metal and we've laid out industrial metal, let's talk about nu metal, which is kind of a hybrid of both of them put together, but its own thing technically. So nu metal, like I said earlier here, was created when we combined alternative metal and industrial metal together with a bunch of other ideas and with a little bit of talk rapping, talk singing over the tracks, which is kind of a hallmark of nu metal. So there's that component, and or if there's any sort of half rapping or like white guy rapping over the metal music, it's nu metal. It's just a really easy way for you to know that it's nu metal because that's their way. So to start off with, we begin in a proto version of an earlier album for Pantera than what we talked about previously on their album Cowboys from Hell in 1990, and the track is Cowboys from Hell, the track. So this is very, very early nu metal. Pantera was very clearly out in front trying to experiment with a bunch of different ideas all at the same time. They took what Nine Inch Nails was doing, they added a little bit of that alternative or even Metallica ideas into it, and they created this thing that sounds like it's almost going in that direction of nu metal, but they haven't quite figured it out yet. And it's interesting too that this happened in 1990 because it was before the grunge movement started to really take off, or even the neo roots rock stuff started to take over. So it's more purely its own thing, and it sounds like it's hearkening more so back to what was happening in the late 80s. It's a really interesting time capsule to go back and listen to this track or the album as a whole. If you really want to get that metal education, I'd recommend just going back and listening to certainly that track, and if you're into it, go listen to the rest of the album, because it does give you a lot of those really early signs of what was just about to go underground when grunge took over everything. And then 2 years later, we get back to Vulgar Display of Power with a nu metal track that was on that album, and it's the first wave officially, and the track is Mouth for War, which we definitely talked about in the episode where we talked about that Pantera album. So this track sounds like it's more fully realized than what they were doing a couple years ago. It sounds like it's got a stronger perspective. It's got more industrial metal thrown into it. It's got some of those grunge elements and also the alternative metal ideas that have become more fully realized, mostly by them, because they also started the conversation for us around alternative metal, and not the proto version with Jane's Addiction, but they were the first like official. So Vulgar Display of Power was the beginning of a lot of things, it seems like, where industrial metal already existed. This album right here seemed to create a platform for alternative metal and new metal, which was its cousin, right all in one shot. So pretty critical album. And then we have to wait 5 more years. So we had to wait for the dust to settle around grunge for us to get to the second wave. So it's not like we skipped over a wave here. We're just getting to the second wave with Around the Fur by Deftones on the album Around the Fur. This sounds far more realized about what new metal is. There's a little bit of that kind of half talking, singing, white guy rapping thing going on. The grinding beats are more intense, like on the industrial metal side. We've left behind a lot of those grunge concepts. They're still there to a certain extent, but they're more just carries over on the growling side or the angry side or the passionate side. So that's what Deftones are bringing. It also a little bit sounds like late stage Pixies, which is interesting that they're kind of cycling back to that idea. There's a lot going on here that really shows that they're evolving into whatever new metal is going to be now that the smoke has cleared around grunge. So then 1 year later, we get to the third wave. So we're just aggressively evolving now. So the third wave, 1998, 1 year later, with the track Got the Life by Korn, with a K, on the album Follow the Leader. So we talked about Korn a couple different times. We didn't talk about Follow the Leader, though. It was one of the Korn albums we did not yet talk about, so we're going to talk about it a little bit. It's not quite yet gotten to the point where they got to in their 1999 album that I talked about at length, but it's really well on the way. I mean, Got the Life is one of their mid-stage hits for the 90s. They had some earlier hits than this. Obviously, after this, they had a bunch of hits too. This is one of those mid-journey hits for them. And it's just got that kind of growling, grinding beat, and the guitar work, again, growling and grimy and grungy. And there's a lot of that kind of shout, rapping, singing thing going on that Korn is known for, but it's just taking what Deftones was doing a year prior and just taking it even further than that. So it's a whole new wave. And also they have that jagged high note sound that just sounds like you're scraping a bow against a violin aggressively. So they've got that too, which again is another hallmark of new metal, alternative metal. So it's very much in the zeitgeist at the moment. And then 1 year later, 1999, we get into a fourth wave. So we just keep skipping and skipping and skipping down these waves, and they're just so aggressively evolving now that they know what this is. All these artists are just leaping on it and doing new and different things all the time. And this one in particular is Eyeless by Slipknot on their album Slipknot. So we definitely didn't talk about Slipknot at all because that was way below the radar for me. This track is really great, first of all, so maybe I have to rethink Slipknot, but also it evolves off what Got the Life was doing, and it also meaningfully evolves off of what was happening with Korn in 1999 too. So where Korn's album in 1999 might have still been sticking around third wave, this is taking it even further than that. So the pushes and the pushes and the pushes at the very end of the 90s around new metal were wild. And it also did create a very clear picture that new metal, at least in the metal sphere, was going to become the law of the land going into the 2000s, just because it was what was happening most aggressively. Like industrial metal certainly happening. It was a little bit more under the radar than new metal, which was much more taking over. Alternative metal clearly was going in more melodic directions. So like the people that were most committed to just pure unadulterated metal music, new metal was their path. That was their camp and they were going for it. So all the investment is going into new metal right now. So that's the extent of it. 3 subgenres. What'd you think? What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? I'd like to believe that I hit the major notes and the distinctions between all these 3 subgenres, that the Venn diagrams of which are pretty much overlapping 80%. So it's really hard to slice out sometimes. But by the end of the decade, I'd like to believe Incubus's The Warmth, Static X's Bled for Days, and Slipknot's Eyeless sound distinctive enough from one another that you can tell the difference between the 3 subgenres, all in their fourth wave at the end of the 90s. But hopefully you didn't disagree with the idea that these 3 were distinctive from each other somehow. I know that some are offshoots of others, but they are distinctive. And I'd like to believe I didn't say anything necessarily so controversial that people that are really in the know in the metal community are listening to this and going, God, he's just dead wrong, totally wrong, so wrong. Maybe I'm 70% right, but I'm definitely not dead wrong. So putting that where it is. What did I miss? I know that there was a lot of metal that was going on in the 1990s, and I'm glad that we got to it. We didn't talk about neoclassical metal at all because it was really just kind of getting going in the latter half of the 90s. I'm sure we'll get to it more meaningfully when we get to the 2000s and like Dragon Force shows up and stuff like that. But for right now, we're not totally there yet. We'll get there though. And I know that there were also other offshoots of metal that maybe we didn't get to meaningfully, like rap metal, for example. Some of that's in my 90s recap when I drop it. So, it's not like I just left Rage Against the Machine out. It's in there somewhere. So didn't forget about it. Just didn't evolve nearly as much. So didn't miss it. Just not talking about it. What'd you learn? Did you learn that there was 3 different distinctive subgenres here in the metal space? Did you learn that they were super quiet with the exception of a couple really brave souls that were willing to still put stuff out during the grunge era until grunge fell away and then they felt like they could emerge again with meaningful quality? That's probably just a story I'm telling myself. But at least from my perspective, that's kind of what happened by my view. So could be true, could be not. Maybe I'm reading into it more than I need to, who can say? But hopefully you learned something about metal this time around, and more so than what you probably learned in the 80s recap, because I know that the 80s recap kind of jumped subgenres and we probably didn't dig into it nearly as much over the course of the decade, but hopefully you learned a lot more here. Also more so maybe than you learned during the entirety of the 90s season, because again, I didn't talk too much about metal in the decade. But hopefully this recap gives you something to hold on to. So as a reminder, if you're interested in listening to any of the tracks that I talked about in today's episode, feel free to check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of the episode here. Please make sure that you join us again to listen to any of these other episodes in this season 2 finale series recap where we're going all through these different genres. So join us again. Make sure that you rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us so that other people can find us. Make sure that you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod, and make sure you subscribe so that when these season 2 finale series episodes drop, you know when they happen because they're not happening regularly. They're just happening when I complete them. Additionally, we'll start season 3 eventually in the 2000s, so make sure that you're subscribed and following us on social media so that you know when that's happening. Make sure that you tell everybody. Tell everybody you don't know and everybody that you know, because the metal community in the 90s, I think, was very specific. I think that there was a very core demographic of people that were very much into metal music in the 90s that were not interested in rock music, not interested in pop music, not interested in anything else that was going on for the most part. They were just very deeply living in their metal moment. And those people really, really, really understand metal, and everybody else only barely kind of understands metal. And for the most part, we're probably averse to the idea of it, like Marilyn Manson, Pantera, Korn, Slipknot, Static X, Rammstein to a certain degree. A lot of pop culture people, everyday people, were probably pretty averse to the idea of metal music, scared of it, because where the 80s, metal music was much more in the zeitgeist of what was happening. As we got into the late 80s and the early 90s, metal music started to become a little bit scary and off-putting with bands like Skinny Puppy and the like. And so I presume that as a result, there was a huge population of people that were put off by metal music because it just seemed scary or it seemed strange or unusual or just unnerving. And kind of by design, I think that metal music, being so aggressively, passionately counterculture as it was really telling everybody to step off, get away from them, and just leave them alone. And that was definitely a vibe. But because of that, a lot of people did leave them alone, and it created this really highly just synthesized core demographic of people that were so undeniably committed and dedicated to and worshiping metal music that it was just very separate. Like there was the people that were super hyper into it, a minuscule population that was kind of curious, and then the rest of the population that was just not even regarding it. They were like, okay, you don't want me to talk to you? Fine, I'm going to go over here. So because of that, there's a lot of people out there, I guarantee you, that might find benefit in listening to an episode like this and listening to some of the music that we talk about here today and trying to connect the dots for them on what happened during this era of metal music. Because for as much as I'd like to believe that so much of this music was about get away from me, I don't want to talk to you, the reality was that they kind of did want to talk to people a little bit, but they were just up in their really intense, passionate feelings, and they were listening to this metal music in order to connect with those deep, deep, deep emotions that they were feeling about whatever they were going through, that they did find camaraderie among one another in the metal community. But like, would they be open to the idea of talking to other people about this stuff and getting excited about it with them? Yeah, probably, because it's just music at the end of the day, right? It's just a way to connect to something, connect to someone, connect to the universe. That's the reason that all these artists made this music. That's the reason that people like the music. That's the reason why they all get together and talk about the music incessantly and wear metal band t-shirts, because they want to connect. They're really passionate and really emotional people, and they just want to connect at the end of the day. because it's just music, right? So because of that, you have to tell these people, and maybe even yourself, if you're not really familiar with metal music from the 90s either, that none of this stuff is scary. None of it. It's just deeply, deeply, deeply emotional, intense metal music. Thanks for listening, everybody.